Federal Express Flight 705. On April 7, 1994, a FedEx DC-10 cargo jet lifted off from Memphis bound for San Jose. On board were three seasoned aviators: Captain David Sanders, 49, First Officer Jim Tucker, 42, and Flight Engineer Andy Peterson, 39, along with a single deadheading employee. That passenger, however, carried a deadly secret. His name was Auburn Calloway, a 42-year-old former Navy pilot facing a career-ending hearing the next day. Hidden in his guitar case were two hammers, a spear gun, and a knife. His plan was chilling: kill the crew, crash the jet, and make it appear to be an accident so his family could collect $2.5 million in life insurance payout worth $5.3 million in 2024. Barely 26 minutes into the flight, at 19,000 feet, Calloway struck. He attacked with brutal force, shattering skulls and severing arteries. Peterson's temporal artery was torn, Tucker's skull fractured, and Sanders suffered deep gashes. Yet the crew refused to surrender. Dazed but determined, Tucker used the DC-10 itself as a weapon, throwing the massive jet into 15-degree climbs, 140-degree rolls, and a drive that hit 530 miles per hour, pushing the aircraft past safety limits to disorient the attacker. Blood filled the cockpit, but the fight raged on. Despite losing strength, Sanders wrestled away a hammer while Peterson clung to the spear gun. Tucker, nearly paralyzed on the right side, managed to throttle back and stabilize the jet. They fought Calloway again and again until, battered and bleeding, they finally restrained him. Sanders then guided the DC-10 to Memphis, landing 35,000 pounds overweight and skidding to a halt as emergency crews rushed in. The crew survived, though none ever flew commercially again. Repairs to the jet cost $800,000, and Calloway was sentenced to life without parole. For their valor, the crew received the Gold Medal for Heroism, the highest honor awarded to civilian pilots, a recognition etched in blood and survival. FedEx Express Flight 14. FedEx Express Flight 14 started its long haul from Singapore with stops in Malaysia, Taiwan, and Alaska before heading to Newark, New Jersey. On July 31, 1997, the MD-11F, nicknamed Joshua, was just minutes from completing its journey when things went terribly wrong. The crew of 5, 2 pilots and 3 passengers, were already uneasy. The left engine's thrust reverser wasn't working, past maintenance logs showed brake issues, and they miscalculated the available runway distance. To compensate, the captain aimed to land early, a choice that would prove disastrous. The first touchdown was rough, sending the jet bouncing. About 1,100 feet later, the right landing gear collapsed, the number 3 engine slammed into the runway, and the massive freighter rolled violently. The right wing spars snapped. Fuel ignited, and within seconds, the MD-11 flipped upside down and burst into flames. Incredibly, all 5 on board survived, escaping through a cockpit window, but the aircraft was destroyed. The jet itself wasn't new to trouble. Delivered to FedEx in 1993, it had logged over 13,000 flight hours and had already suffered a tail strike in Anchorage and a bounce landing in Memphis. Captain Robert Freeman, with 11,000 flight hours, and First Officer Donald Gooden, with far fewer MD-11 hours, just 95, were at the controls that day. The National Transportation Safety Board later concluded the crash was caused by over-control during the flare and the captain's failure to abort a destabilized landing. The aftermath was brutal for the captain, who was fired in 2000, though the pilots' union blamed flaws in the MD-11's design. The accident was so strikingly similar to another FedEx MD-11 crash in 2009 that both ended up being featured in the documentary series Air Disasters. One decision to force the landing, paired with an unforgiving aircraft design, turned what should have been a routine arrival into a fiery wreck. FedEx Express Flight 80. FedEx Express Flight 80 lifted off from Guangzhou, China, just after 2 a.m. local time on March 23, 2009, bound for Narita International Airport in Japan. The flight was routine until the very last minutes of its approach, when winds gusting at more than 46 miles per hour turned a landing into a violent struggle. Air traffic control had already warned of 15 knots of wind shear below 2,000 feet, a sign that conditions were anything but stable. At 6:48 a.m., the MD-11F touched down hard on runway 34L. What followed was a deadly sequence of bounces, each harder than the last. The aircraft porpoised, slamming nose gear first, then rocking back with abrupt pitch changes. On the third impact, forces measured around 1,200 feet per minute tore through the airframe. The left wing collapsed, fuel ignited, and within seconds, the trijet flipped upside down, engulfed in flames. On board were just 2 men, Captain Kevin Kyle Mosley, age 54, with more than 12,800 flight hours, and First Officer Anthony Stephen Pino, age 49, a former U.S. Air Force pilot with over 6,300 hours. Both were pulled from the wreckage alive, but succumbed to their injuries before reaching the hospital. It was Narita Airport's first fatal accident, and FedEx's deadliest since 1989. The loss didn't end on the runway. Runway 34L, stretching 13,125 feet, was closed for hours, forcing diversions and cancellations as the shorter parallel runway, just 7,150 feet, couldn't handle larger jets. The wrecked MD-11, built in 1994, had once flown for Delta before FedEx purchased and converted it into a freighter in 2004. Investigators later found fatigue played a role. Neither pilot had more than 4 consecutive hours of sleep in the previous day. Combined with the MD-11's unforgiving handling, the tragedy became another stark reminder of how precision, weather, and human limits can converge in seconds to decide the fate of a flight. FedEx Express Flight 630. FedEx Express Flight 630 was meant to be an ordinary cargo run from Seattle to Memphis on the night of July 28, 2006. At the controls was 57-year-old Captain Jane Aiken, a veteran with 16,000 flight hours, and 38-year-old First Officer Andrew Macha, a former U.S. Air Force pilot with 5,000 hours. Their aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, built back in 1974, had already lived a long, hard life before being converted for FedEx service. The approach to Memphis looked smooth at first. The jet glided toward runway 18R, autopilot steady, until just 400 feet above the ground when the first officer took over. Touchdown seemed normal, until it wasn't. Just 7 seconds later, the left main landing gear collapsed without warning. The wing smashed into the runway. The aircraft lurched violently left, and sparks trailed as metal tore against concrete. It finally skidded to a stop near taxiway M4 before erupting into flames. Inside, all 3 people on board, 2 crew and 1 passenger, managed to escape, but not without injuries. The fire consumed the wing and port engine, leaving the aircraft a charred wreck. The NTSB investigation revealed the failure wasn't a freak accident. A fatigue crack in the gear's air filler valve hole, caused by years of stress and inadequate maintenance, had gone unnoticed. It was the tiny fracture that brought down a 440,000-pound jet. What stands out isn't just the mechanical failure, but the survival. In a crash where fire and metal fatigue conspired to destroy the aircraft, the crew's training and swift escape turned a likely tragedy into a story of survival, though one that scarred FedEx's fleet history forever. FedEx Express Flight 647. FedEx Express Flight 647 left Oakland on the morning of December 18, 2003, bound for Memphis with a crew of 2 and 5 off-duty FedEx pilots riding along. The aircraft, a 32-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-11, had lived many lives. It first flew in 1971 for United Airlines before FedEx bought and converted it into a freighter in 1998. By the time of the accident, it had logged more than 65,000 flight hours. At the controls was a 59-year-old captain with an extraordinary 21,000 hours of experience, and a 44-year-old first officer with 15,000 hours of her own. On paper, this was a highly experienced team. The flight across the country was uneventful, but the landing in Memphis would prove otherwise. At 12:26 p.m., the MD-10 touched down on runway 36R. Almost instantly, the right landing gear collapsed, slamming the aircraft down and sending it careening off the runway. Flames erupted as the fuselage scraped against the pavement. In the scramble to escape, the first officer and one of the off-duty pilots suffered minor injuries. Chaos worsened when an untrained passenger mistakenly deployed the emergency slide in raft mode, causing it to detach from the aircraft instead of staying in place. The NTSB investigation revealed harsh truths. The weather wasn't to blame. Crosswinds were well within limits. The real issue was pilot error. The first officer failed to align and slow the aircraft properly, causing an excessively hard landing. As the jet hit, the right wing dipped about 6 degrees, a stress the landing gear wasn't built to survive. Investigators also faulted the captain for not catching these mistakes in time. Though all 7 people survived, the MD-10 was consumed by fire and written off. The incident became a textbook case of how a routine landing with seasoned pilots and clear skies can unravel in seconds through a chain of small but critical errors. FedEx Express Flight 910. On October 28, 2016, a FedEx Express MD-10 touched down at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport after a routine flight from Memphis. What should have been an uneventful landing turned into chaos within seconds. As the jet rolled down runway 10L, the left main landing gear collapsed, sending the left wing and engine grinding against the pavement before bursting into flames. The aircraft came to a halt about 6,580 feet down the runway, half off the pavement, fire consuming its wing. Both pilots escaped through the cockpit window using an emergency rope, but the 55-year-old captain sustained minor injuries. The jet itself had a long, storied life. Built in 1972 as a passenger DC-10 for United Airlines, it was converted into cargo service after FedEx purchased it in 1997. By the time of the accident, the aircraft was 44 years old, with 84,589 flight hours across more than 35,600 takeoff and landing cycles. Its 3 General Electric CF660 engines still pushed it across the skies, but the years had left unseen weaknesses. Investigators from the NTSB quickly uncovered the root cause. The collapse wasn't a fluke. It was a metal fatigue crack in the left landing gear. A crack that grew over countless landings until the structure finally gave way. Even more damning was the revelation that FedEx had failed to perform an overhaul at the manufacturer's 8-year inspection interval, a lapse that allowed the problem to go undetected. The crew's military backgrounds, both veterans of the Gulf War, Bosnian War, and Kosovo War, undoubtedly helped in their rapid escape. Though only 2 lives were at stake, their quick actions and training kept the accident from becoming far worse. The fire destroyed much of the aircraft, but the survival of both pilots turned a potential disaster into a costly lesson about maintenance, oversight, and fatigue in aging fleets. Empire Airlines Flight 8284. In the early hours of January 27, 2009, a FedEx feeder cargo flight operated by Empire Airlines was en approach to Lubbock Preston Smith International Airport. The aircraft, an ATR 42-320 built in 1990, had been flying for nearly 19 years, logging over 28,700 flight hours and more than 32,000 takeoff and landing cycles. Once a passenger plane, it had been converted to freighter use in 2005, carrying packages instead of people. On this night, however, the skies brought more than deliveries. At the controls was 52-year-old Captain Rodney Holberton, a veteran with 13,935 flight hours, including over 12,700 as pilot in command. By his side sat 26-year-old First Officer Heather Cornell, far newer to the profession, with just over 2,100 hours logged and barely 130 hours on the ATR 42. In the freezing mist before dawn, their aircraft faced a critical malfunction. The flaps refused to deploy. Instead of breaking off the approach, the captain tried to fix the issue while the first officer pressed ahead. Airspeed slipped away unnoticed. The descent rate hit 2,000 feet per minute, triggering a desperate pull-up alarm. Yet thrust wasn't applied until 17 seconds later. Far too late. The turboprop stalled, slammed into the ground short of the runway, and skidded 3,300 feet across the pavement, fire sparking along its path. Both crew members survived with minor injuries, but the aircraft was damaged beyond repair. The NTSB investigation pulled no punches. Poor crew coordination, failure to monitor airspeed, fatigue, and the captain's decision to push on with an unstabilized approach caused the crash. The wreck of N902FX was written off, but the lessons traveled far. Regulators issued new safety rules. Simulator training for icing was expanded, and Europe's Aviation Authority renewed stall warning systems to prevent another close call. This was a crash born not of weather or machine alone, but of human error under pressure. FedEx Express Flight 087. On October 17, 1999, FedEx Express Flight 087, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 valued at $120 million, ended its journey not on a runway but submerged in the waters of Subic Bay, Philippines. The aircraft had departed Shanghai Hongqiao International Airport, carrying a cargo of electronics and clothing bound for FedEx's hub at Subic Bay. On board were just 2 seasoned pilots, and by the time the ordeal was over, both would escape with their lives, but the jet would be lost forever. The 9-year-old aircraft, powered by 3 General Electric CF6 engines, had logged 30,278 flight hours over 5,817 cycles. At the controls was 53-year-old Captain Michael Rooney, boasting 14,000 flight hours, alongside 43-year-old First Officer Cynthia Hubbard, a former USAF pilot with 5,700 hours, including 2,300 on the MD-11. Their experience, however, wasn't enough to counter a hidden danger: blocked pitot tubes that fed the cockpit false airspeed readings. Trouble began mid-flight when speed discrepancies appeared between the captain's and first officer's instruments. By the time the aircraft descended toward runway 07, the autopilot had already disconnected multiple times. Overspeed warnings had blared, and confusion set in. At 3:55 p.m., the jet touched down but failed to slow. It tore through the end of the runway, smashing into antennas, fences, and a concrete post before plunging into the bay. Only the cockpit remained above water as fuel leaked into the sea and much of the cargo was destroyed. Investigators later found the pitot tubes clogged with crystalline particles, residue, and even dead insects, causing airspeed errors up to 45 knots. The report blamed improper maintenance and inadequate crew response, noting neither pilot had been trained to handle this failure. In the aftermath, Boeing revised manuals and new inspection requirements were issued, but the wreck of N581FE remains a stark reminder of how a block sensor can bring down a 440,000-pound aircraft in seconds. FedEx Express Flight 147A. In the early hours of July 26, 2002, FedEx Express Flight 147A, a Boeing 727-232F built in 1974, lined up for its final approach into Tallahassee International Airport. What should have been a routine cargo run from Memphis instead ended with a fiery crash just short of the runway. On board were only 3 crew members, all of whom survived, though each suffered serious injuries. The aircraft, however, was completely destroyed. The jet, tail number N497FE, carried a long history. First delivered to Delta Airlines in 1986, before eventually being converted into a freighter in 1989. Its captain that night, 55-year-old William Walsh, brought more than 13,000 flight hours of experience. First Officer William Fry, a 44-year-old former Navy pilot, had logged 8,500 hours, while Flight Engineer David Mendez, just 33, had 2,600 hours, including 346 on the Boeing 727. Flight 1478 departed Memphis at 4:12 a.m., with Fry flying. Initially set for runway 27, the crew switched to a visual approach for runway 09 around 5:24 a.m. Conditions were dark, the control tower wasn't yet open, and Jacksonville controllers monitored from afar. By 5:36 a.m., the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet, but warning signs appeared. The precision approach path indicator lights glowed red, signaling the jet was below the safe glide path. The ground proximity warning system called out 500, yet the captain reassured stable. Seconds later, the 727 clipped 50-foot trees, skidded 1,100 feet, struck a construction vehicle, and spun 260 degrees before stopping. The NTSB investigation pointed to fatigue, failure to maintain proper altitude, and poor crew coordination. Crucially, Fry's color blindness made distinguishing to the PAP lights nearly impossible. This controlled flight into terrain underscored how a chain of small oversights, fatigue, visual misjudgment, and a missed go-around can bring down a $20 million aircraft in the blink of an eye.